It was a quiet Thursday night, and Sam had just finished his late shift at the diner. The clock read 1:30 a.m. as he got into his car, exhausted but eager to get home. The night was cold, with a thick fog hanging low over the deserted roads. As Sam drove through the empty streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The eerie silence was only broken by the soft hum of his car's engine and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a figure appeared on the side of the road, waving frantically for help. Sam's heart skipped a beat, and his foot instinctively hit the brake. He squinted through the fog and saw a woman, her clothes disheveled, standing alone in the darkness. She looked terrified, and despite his better judgment, Sam pulled over to see what was wrong. As the woman approached his car, Sam rolled down the window slightly. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. The woman nodded, her eyes wide with fear, and pointed down the road. "Please, I need to get away from here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. Sam hesitated for a moment, but then unlocked the passenger door. The woman quickly got in, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Thank you," she murmured, staring straight ahead. Sam noticed that her hands were trembling as she clutched her seatbelt. "What happened? Are you hurt?" he asked, glancing over at her. The woman shook her head, her eyes still fixed on the road ahead. "No, just drive, please," she insisted. Sam nodded and began driving again, the tension in the car palpable. He couldn't help but steal glances at the woman as they drove through the fog. There was something off about her, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Her clothes looked old, almost as if they were from another time, and her skin was unnaturally pale. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the only sound being the tires on the wet road. Sam's unease grew with every passing second. "Where do you need to go?" he finally asked, hoping to break the silence. The woman turned to look at him for the first time, her eyes filled with a sadness that made his heart ache. "Just keep driving," she replied softly. As they continued down the deserted road, the fog seemed to grow thicker, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. The tension in the car was almost unbearable, and Sam's mind raced with questions. Who was this woman? What was she running from? And why did she seem so familiar? Suddenly the woman spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I used to drive on this road every night just like you," she said, her gaze distant. "But one night, something terrible happened." Sam's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "What happened?" he asked, his voice tense. The woman sighed, her eyes filled with sorrow. "I was in a car accident," she said quietly. "I didn't make it." Sam's blood ran cold as the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He turned to look at the woman, his heart pounding in his chest. But she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, as if she had never been there at all. Sam's hands shook as he pulled over to the side of the road, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Sam sat in his car, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He glanced around, half expecting to see the woman standing by the side of the road, but there was no one there. The fog had cleared slightly, revealing the empty road stretching out before him. Sam's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. Had he imagined the whole thing? Was he losing his mind? But then he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The passenger seat, where the woman had been sitting just moments ago, was wet. There was a small puddle of water on the seat, as if someone had been sitting there in soaking wet clothes. Sam's hands shook as he reached out to touch the wet spot, his mind racing with fear and confusion. How was this possible? As he sat there, his mind reeling, he suddenly heard a faint whisper coming from the back seat. "Help me." Sam's blood ran cold as he slowly turned around, his heart pounding in his chest. There in the back seat was the woman, her eyes filled with tears. "Please help me," she whispered, her voice filled with desperation. Sam's mind raced as he tried to comprehend what was happening. The woman, who had seemingly disappeared just moments ago, was now sitting in his back seat, begging for help. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice trembling with fear. The woman looked at him, her eyes filled with sadness. "I just want to go home," she whispered. Without thinking, Sam started the car and began driving again, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. He didn't know where he was going, but he had a feeling that the woman would guide him. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the fog thickening around them as they drove. Sam's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced in the rearview mirror, only to see that the woman was gone once again. But this time, he wasn't scared. Instead, he felt a strange sense of peace, as if he had done something right. As he continued down the road, the fog began to clear, revealing the familiar streets of his hometown. Sam pulled into his driveway, his hands still shaking as he turned off the car. He sat there for a moment, trying to process everything that had just happened. As he got out of the car and made his way to his front door, he couldn't help but glance back at the car one last time. And there, standing in the driveway, was the woman, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, before disappearing into the night. Sam stood there, his heart filled with a strange mixture of fear and peace. He didn't know what had just happened, but he knew one thing for sure. He would never forget that night. It was a warm summer night, and Jake was driving home after visiting a friend in a nearby town. The highway was deserted, with no other cars in sight. Jake enjoyed the solitude, the cool night breeze blowing through his open window as he cruised down the empty road. The stars were bright, and the full moon illuminated the landscape around him. As he drove, Jake couldn't help but feel a strange sense of unease. The road stretched on endlessly, with no sign of civilization in sight. The silence was unnerving, and Jake found himself constantly glancing in his rearview mirror, but there was nothing there, just the dark, empty road behind him. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the feeling as nothing more than his imagination. But then, out of nowhere, Jake noticed a pair of headlights in the distance, quickly approaching from behind. He frowned, wondering where the car had come from. The highway had been completely empty just moments ago. The headlights grew brighter, and Jake realized that the car was speeding towards him at an alarming rate. Jake's heart began to race as the car closed in on him. He tried to speed up, but the mysterious vehicle was gaining on him fast. Within seconds, it was right on his tail, its headlights blinding in his rearview mirror. Jake could barely make out the car's make or model, but he could tell that it was an old, beat-up sedan. He felt a surge of panic as the car began to swerve back and forth behind him, as if trying to force him off the road. Jake gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with fear. He had no idea who was driving the car or what they wanted, but he knew he had to get away. Jake slammed his foot on the gas, the engine roaring as he sped down the highway. The car behind him followed suit, matching his speed with ease. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to outrun the mysterious vehicle, but no matter how fast he went, it stayed right behind him, its headlights blazing like two ominous eyes in the darkness. As Jake raced down the highway, his mind raced with questions. Who was driving the car? Why were they chasing him? And how had they appeared out of nowhere on an empty highway? The more he thought about it, the more terrified he became. There was something unnatural about the whole situation, something that made his skin crawl. Suddenly, the car behind him accelerated, pulling up beside him in the next lane. Jake glanced over, his heart nearly stopping as he saw the driver for the first time. The figure behind the wheel was a shadowy silhouette with no discernible features. It was as if the driver was made of pure darkness, their face hidden in the shadows. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the figure, unable to look away. The shadowy driver turned their head slowly, as if acknowledging Jake's presence, and then did something that sent chills down his spine. They smiled. The smile was twisted and sinister, filled with malice and something else. Something inhuman. Jake's heart pounded as he tore his gaze away from the shadowy figure and focused on the road ahead. He had to get away, and fast. Without thinking, he swerved sharply into the next lane, trying to put as much distance between himself and the mysterious car as possible. The tires screeched as he sped down the highway, the adrenaline pumping through his veins. But the car wasn't giving up. It swerved back into Jake's lane, inching closer and closer with every passing second. Jake's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out. He knew he couldn't keep this up much longer. The car was too fast, too relentless. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Jake saw a sign for an upcoming exit. He didn't think twice. He yanked the steering wheel to the right, barely managing to stay on the road as he took the exit at high speed. The car behind him followed, but Jake didn't care. He was focused solely on getting away, on surviving this terrifying ordeal. Jake's car skidded onto the exit ramp, the tires screeching as he fought to keep control. The highway had led to a smaller, winding road that cut through a dense forest. The trees loomed ominously on either side, their branches casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. Jake didn't slow down, hoping the narrow road would give him an advantage over the mysterious car. But as he glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw that the car was still behind him, its headlights glaring through the darkness. Panic surged through Jake as he pushed the gas pedal to the floor, his car tearing down the winding road at breakneck speed. Suddenly, just as quickly as it had appeared, the car began to fade. The headlights dimmed, the engine's roar softened, and within seconds, the car had vanished completely, as if it had never existed. Jake's heart raced as he looked around, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The road behind him was empty, the silence returning like a heavy blanket. Jake pulled over to the side of the road, his hands shaking as he tried to catch his breath. He couldn't believe it. The car was gone just like that. But as he sat there, the fear slowly began to dissipate, replaced by a strange sense of relief. Whatever had been chasing him was gone, and Jake knew he had narrowly escaped something truly terrifying. The storm had come out of nowhere, turning a calm evening into a chaotic nightmare. Sarah was driving home from a friend's house, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. The rain was coming down in sheets, pounding against the windshield with relentless force. The wipers struggled to keep up, but they were no match for the torrential downpour. The winding country road was poorly lit, with only the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the way ahead. Sarah squinted through the windshield, trying to make out the road as the rain lashed against her car. The thunder rumbled overhead, shaking the car with its intensity. Sarah's heart raced as she tried to stay focused, her mind racing with the possibility of what could go wrong on such a treacherous night. Suddenly, a flash of lightning illuminated the road ahead, and Sarah gasped in shock. There, standing in the middle of the road, was a figure drenched in rain, waving frantically. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she hit the brakes, the car skidding to a stop just inches away from the person. She stared in disbelief as the figure, a young woman, approached the car. Sarah hesitated for a moment, her instincts telling her to drive away, but the woman looked so desperate, so soaked to the bone, that Sarah couldn't leave her out in the storm. She reached over and unlocked the passenger door. The woman quickly got in, her wet clothes clinging to her skin, and shivered violently as she buckled her seatbelt. "Thank you," the woman murmured, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. Sarah nodded, though she felt a knot of unease in her stomach. Something about the woman seemed off, but Sarah couldn't put her finger on it. The woman's hair was plastered to her face, obscuring her features, and her clothes were soaked through, dripping water onto the car seat. "Where are you headed?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared straight ahead, her eyes unfocused. "Just drive," she finally whispered. Sarah frowned but complied, turning the car back onto the road. The storm raged on outside, the rain hammering against the car as they drove in silence. As they drove, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. The woman beside her was completely silent, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. Sarah glanced over at her, trying to make conversation. "Where were you headed? Do you live around here?" she asked, but the woman didn't respond. The tension in the car was thick, the silence almost suffocating. Sarah's mind raced with questions. Who was this woman? Why was she out in the storm alone? And why wouldn't she say anything? The more Sarah thought about it, the more uneasy she became. The woman's presence was unnerving, almost as if she didn't belong there. Suddenly the woman spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was on my way home," she said, her tone distant. Sarah nodded, relieved that the woman was finally speaking. "Where's home?" she asked, trying to keep the conversation going. The woman turned to look at Sarah, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. "It's not far," she replied, but there was something in her voice that made Sarah's skin crawl. The storm raged on as Sarah continued driving, the unease growing with each passing mile. The woman had fallen silent again, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Sarah's mind raced with questions, but she didn't dare ask any more. The atmosphere in the car was too tense, too unsettling. Finally, the woman spoke again, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "You can drop me off here," she said, pointing to a small, overgrown path that led off the main road. Sarah frowned, confused. There was no sign of a house or any other structure nearby. "Are you sure?" she asked, but the woman nodded. "Yes, this is where I live." Reluctantly, Sarah pulled over and stopped the car. The woman unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. "Thank you," she whispered before stepping out into the rain. Sarah watched as she walked down the overgrown path, her figure quickly disappearing into the darkness. Just as Sarah was about to drive away, she noticed something lying on the passenger seat. It was a small, old-fashioned locket, its chain tangled. Curious, Sarah picked it up and opened it. Inside was a faded photograph of the woman she had just given a ride to, but something was wrong. The photo looked old, much older than it should have been. A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she stared at the locket. The photo inside looked like it had been taken decades ago, yet the woman in the picture was the same one she had just dropped off. Panic surged through her as she glanced back at the path where the woman had disappeared. But there was no sign of her. Desperate for answers, Sarah turned the car around and drove back to the small town she had passed earlier. She found a diner that was still open and rushed inside. The locket clutched in her hand. The elderly waitress behind the counter looked up as Sarah approached. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Do you know this woman?" She held out the locket, hoping for some kind of explanation. The waitress took one look at the photo and paled. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice shaking. I gave her a ride. She left this in my car," Sarah stammered, confusion and fear battling for control. The waitress shook her head, her eyes wide with horror. "That's impossible," she whispered. "That woman, she died in a car accident on this very road over 50 years ago." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as the waitress's words sank in. The woman she had picked up was a ghost, a restless spirit doomed to wander the stormy night for eternity. The locket slipped from Sarah's hand and clattered to the floor, its haunting secret now revealed. It was a chilly autumn evening when Mark set out on a road trip to visit his parents in a small town upstate. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a deep shade of purple. Mark enjoyed driving at night. There was something peaceful about the empty roads and the hum of the engine. As he drove through the countryside, the trees lining the road cast long shadows, and the cool night air filled the car. Mark's route took him down a lonely, winding road that cut through a dense forest. The road was narrow and poorly lit, with only the occasional street lamp providing some relief from the darkness. Mark switched on his high beams, the bright lights cutting through the inky blackness ahead. As he rounded a bend, Mark noticed something strange. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, was a faint light. At first he thought it might be another car, but as he got closer, he realized it was moving much too slowly. The light swayed back and forth as if it were floating in midair. Curiosity got the better of Mark, and he slowed down, peering into the darkness ahead. The light continued to move, its eerie glow becoming more pronounced as he approached. Finally, Mark could make out the source of the light. A car, an old-fashioned sedan, was crawling along the road at a snail's pace. Its headlights were dim, barely illuminating the road ahead. Mark frowned, wondering why the driver was going so slow. He honked his horn, hoping to get their attention, but the car didn't speed up or move aside. Annoyed, Mark decided to overtake the car. As he pulled up beside it, he glanced over, intending to give the driver a piece of his mind. But what he saw made his blood run cold. The car was empty. The driver's seat was vacant, the steering wheel turning on its own as the car continued to crawl along the road. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the phantom car, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. Mark's foot hovered over the brake pedal as he tried to make sense of the situation. The car beside him was moving steadily, its wheels turning, but there was no driver. The windows were rolled down, and Mark could see the interior clearly. The seats were worn and covered in dust, as if the car hadn't been used in years. A chill ran down Mark's spine as he realized that the car wasn't just empty. It was old, impossibly old. The design was something out of the 1950s, with chrome accents and a faded paint job that had once been a vibrant red. The car looked like it had driven straight out of a different era. Mark quickly accelerated, leaving the phantom car behind. But as he sped down the road, his mind raced with questions. How was the car moving without a driver? And where had it come from? The more he thought about it, the more unsettled he became. There was something deeply wrong about the whole situation, something that defied logic and reason. Just as Mark began to think he had left the eerie encounter behind, he glanced in his rearview mirror and saw the headlights of the phantom car growing brighter. His heart skipped a beat as he realized that the car was following him, its dim headlights piercing through the darkness like two ghostly eyes. Mark's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he pressed down on the gas pedal, trying to put as much distance between himself and the phantom car as possible. But no matter how fast he drove, the car stayed right behind him, its engine silent as it glided down the road with unnatural ease. Panic surged through Mark as he weaved in and out of the winding road, the trees blurring past him. The phantom car was relentless, its headlights locked onto him like a predator stalking its prey. Mark's mind raced as he tried to think of a way to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The road was too narrow, the forest too dense. Just when Mark thought he couldn't take it anymore, the road opened up into a small clearing. Mark spotted an old abandoned gas station on the side of the road and made a split-second decision. He swerved off the road and pulled into the station, his tires screeching as he came to a stop. He watched in horror as the phantom car followed him into the clearing, its headlights still locked onto him. But then, something strange happened. As the car entered the light of the gas station, its form began to waver, like a mirage in the desert. The car flickered and shimmered, its outline growing faint. Mark stared in disbelief as the car slowly faded away, its headlights dimming until they were nothing more than two faint orbs of light. Within seconds, the car had disappeared completely, leaving nothing but an eerie silence in its wake. Mark sat in his car, his heart pounding in his chest as he tried to process what had just happened. The phantom car was gone, but the terror it had left behind was all too real. Mark took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he gripped the steering wheel. He knew one thing for sure: he would never drive down that road again. Tom and his friends had always been fascinated by the paranormal, so when they heard about the old mansion on Blackwood Road, they couldn't resist the urge to check it out. The mansion had been abandoned for decades, its once grand facade now crumbling and overgrown with ivy. The locals claimed it was haunted, that strange lights could be seen flickering in the windows at night. One cold October evening, Tom and his friends decided to drive out to the mansion and see if the rumors were true. The road to the mansion was long and winding, cutting through a dense forest that seemed to close in around them as they drove deeper into the woods. The full moon cast eerie shadows on the road, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. As they approached the mansion, Tom felt a chill run down his spine. The mansion loomed ahead, its dark windows like empty eyes staring back at them. The gate creaked as they pushed it open, and they drove slowly up the overgrown driveway. The mansion looked even more ominous up close, its once grand entrance now covered in vines and debris. The friends parked the car and hesitated for a moment, the eerie silence of the night pressing down on them. Finally, Tom took a deep breath and led the way up the crumbling steps to the front door. The door creaked open with a loud groan, and they stepped inside. The interior of the mansion was just as dilapidated as the outside. Dust covered every surface, and the air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. The friends wandered through the dark, empty rooms, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The mansion was eerily quiet, the only sound the creaking of the old floorboards beneath their feet. As they explored, they began to notice strange things. Shadows flickered at the edge of their vision, and the air seemed to grow colder the deeper they went into the mansion. Tom's heart raced as he felt a presence behind him, but when he turned around, there was nothing there. The others seemed to feel it too, their nervous glances and hushed whispers betraying their unease. Just as they were about to leave, something caught Tom's eye. A faint light flickered in one of the upstairs windows. It was barely noticeable, but it was enough to make his blood run cold. "Did you see that?" he whispered to his friends. They all turned to look, their eyes wide with fear. Without thinking, Tom led the way upstairs, his heart pounding in his chest. The staircase creaked under their weight, and the air grew colder with each step. When they reached the top, they saw it, a faint ghostly light glowing from the end of the hallway. The friends exchanged nervous glances, but curiosity got the better of them, and they slowly made their way toward the light. As they approached, the light flickered and then disappeared, leaving them in total darkness. Panic set in as they fumbled for their flashlights, the sudden silence pressing down on them like a weight. But before they could turn on their lights, something happened that made their blood run cold. A soft whisper echoed through the hallway, a voice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Get out." Fear gripped Tom and his friends as the whispering grew louder, the voice now joined by the sound of footsteps echoing through the darkness. They didn't need any more convincing. They turned and ran, their footsteps thundering down the hallway as they raced back to the staircase. But as they reached the top of the stairs, the lights flickered back on, revealing a figure standing at the bottom. The friends froze in terror as they saw a ghostly apparition, a woman in a tattered dress, her eyes hollow and dark. She stood silently, her gaze fixed on them, her presence radiating a malevolent energy. With a scream, Tom and his friends bolted down the stairs, the ghostly figure vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. They didn't stop running until they were back in the car, the engine roaring to life as they sped away from the mansion. As they drove away, the mansion disappearing into the distance, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the ghostly figure chasing after them, but there was nothing there, just the dark, empty road stretching out behind them. The friends drove in silence, the fear and adrenaline still coursing through their veins. When they finally reached the safety of Tom's house, they all agreed never to speak of what had happened at the mansion, but the memory of that night would haunt them forever. Weeks later, Tom was scrolling through an old local history website when something caught his eye. It was a photo of the mansion, taken decades ago when it was still in its prime. But it wasn't the mansion that sent a chill down his spine. It was the woman standing in front of it, the same woman they had seen that night, her hollow eyes staring back at him from the faded photograph. It was a rainy, foggy night when Jane found herself driving down a desolate stretch of road. The rain hammered against the windshield, and the wipers struggled to keep up. Jane was on her way back from a late-night shift at the hospital, her body exhausted, but her mind alert. The road was empty, the headlights barely cutting through the thick fog that hung in the air. As she drove, Jane noticed something up ahead. A figure standing by the side of the road, drenched and shivering in the rain. It was a woman, her hair plastered to her face, her clothes clinging to her body. Jane's heart went out to her. It was no night to be out in the open, especially on such a lonely road. She slowed down and pulled over, rolling down the window slightly. "Do you need a ride?" Jane called out. The woman nodded, her expression one of gratitude. Jane unlocked the door, and the woman climbed in, water dripping onto the seat. "Thank you," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. As they drove in silence, Jane couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woman sat quietly beside her, staring straight ahead, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her clothes were old-fashioned, the kind of attire Jane hadn't seen in years. But it wasn't just the clothes, it was the woman herself. There was something about her that made Jane uneasy. The rain continued to pour, the road ahead barely visible. Jane tried to make small talk, but the woman's responses were curt and distant. "Where are you headed?" Jane asked, but the woman simply pointed straight ahead. "Just keep going," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. Jane felt a chill run down her spine, but she forced herself to keep driving. She didn't want to seem rude, but the silence was becoming unbearable. She glanced over at the woman, hoping to find some clue as to who she was and where she was going. But the woman's face was expressionless, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. As they continued down the road, Jane began to notice something strange. The temperature inside the car seemed to be dropping despite the heater being on full blast. She shivered, glancing at the woman beside her, but the woman didn't seem to notice the cold. She sat still as a statue, her hands still clasped in her lap. Jane's unease grew with each passing mile. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the rain and fog obscuring everything around them. Finally, the woman spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can drop me off here," she said, pointing to a small clearing by the side of the road. Jane frowned, confused. There was nothing there, just trees and darkness. "Are you sure?" she asked. But the woman nodded. "Yes, this is where I need to be." Reluctantly, Jane pulled over and stopped the car. The woman unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. "Thank you," the woman said as she stepped out into the rain. Jane watched as she walked away, her figure quickly disappearing into the fog. But just as Jane was about to drive away, she noticed something lying on the seat where the woman had been sitting. A small, old-fashioned locket. Curiosity piqued. Jane picked up the locket and opened it. Inside was a faded photograph of a young woman, her face hauntingly familiar. Jane's heart skipped a beat as she realized that the woman in the photo was the same woman she had just given a ride to. But there was something wrong. The photo looked old, much older than it should have been. A chill ran down Jane's spine as she stared at the photo, her mind racing. How could the woman in the photo be the same one she had just seen? It didn't make any sense. Desperate for answers, Jane decided to turn around and head back to the nearest town. Maybe someone there could explain what had just happened. She drove back through the fog and rain, her mind reeling with questions. When she reached the town, she found a small diner that was still open and rushed inside, the locket clutched in her hand. The elderly waitress behind the counter looked up as Jane approached, her expression curious. "Excuse me," Jane said, her voice trembling. "Do you know anything about this locket?" She held out the locket, hoping for some kind of explanation. The waitress took one look at the photo and paled. "Where did you get this?" the waitress asked, her voice shaking. Jane hesitated, unsure of how to explain. I gave a woman a ride, and she left it in my car." Jane stammered, the confusion and fear evident in her voice. The waitress shook her head, her eyes wide with horror. "That's impossible," she whispered. "That woman, she died in a car accident on that road over 50 years ago." Jane felt the blood drain from her face as the waitress's words sank in. The woman she had picked up was a ghost, a restless spirit doomed to wander the foggy night for eternity. The locket slipped from Jane's hand and clattered to the floor, its haunting secret now revealed. Jane sat in stunned silence, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The rain continued to pour outside, the sound of it beating against the windows filling the empty diner. The waitress, seeing Jane's distress, offered her a seat and a cup of hot coffee. As Jane sipped the coffee, her hands trembling, she couldn't help but think about the woman she had encountered. Who was she? Why had she appeared to Jane? And what did it mean that she had left the locket behind? Days turned into weeks and Jane couldn't shake the memory of that night. The locket, now in her possession, served as a constant reminder of the eerie encounter. She tried to move on, but the experience had left a lasting impression on her, one that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Every time she drove down that lonely road, she couldn't help but glance at the passenger seat, half expecting to see the ghostly figure of the woman sitting there once again, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. And every time it rained, Jane's heart would skip a beat, the memory of that night returning with a chilling clarity.